We are here with Amoda Ma Jeevan. Is it Jeevan? Amoda?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's
Close enough, right? Amoda is a contemporary spiritual teacher and author. In 2002, after many years of spiritual seeking, meditation, and immersion in psycho-spiritual practices, an experience of the dark night of the soul led to a profound inner awakening. In surrendering wholeheartedly to the unfolding unknownness and aliveness of this moment, she became a naked lover of what is. Since that time, all seeking stopped, all methods dropped, and a gentle but unequivocal coming home to rest in unconditioned, non-dual awareness has become embodied as a living reality. In 2012, Amoda started speaking from silence in small gatherings in the UK. Today, she offers meetings and retreats to a growing global audience and is a frequent speaker at the SAND conference and other events in the USA. She's recently moved from England to the Bay Area with her husband and beloved Kavi. She is the author of Radical Awakening and the soon-to-be-released Embodied Enlightenment. Okay, welcome, Amoda Ma.
Thank you, Jacqueline.
And let's see. Let me make sure I've got her sound set up. Can you all hear Amoda, or do I need to switch things around a little bit here? Cannot hear her. Well, then let's.
You can't hear me. Maybe if I speak, then I.
Yeah, that would help, wouldn't it?
That would help.
Let me switch where I've got the microphone. Okay, folks, how about it now? So, Amoda?
Yeah, can you hear me now? Is that good?
Well, let's see. Better.
Better.
Well, she's coming through pretty loud for me. I can turn you up. I will turn you up.
Okay.
Oh.
Oh no, that's me. No, I'd better turn that down. Hold on.
Yeah. Okay.
How's that?
How's that? Good. Everybody says good. Yay. Okay, now we're on.
Okay.
So, Amoda, thank you so much for joining us. I was telling Amoda before we got started that the way I became familiar with her was when I gave a talk. You guys may remember, it's been a while back, in the sanctuary for our Sunday morning gathering called Seeing Through the Eyes of Wholeness. And I had typed that into to Google, and Amoda Ma had also given a talk titled Seeing Through the Eyes of Wholeness, which we talked about at that time in the room, and I found it very inspiring. So I'm just tickled as I can be to be here live with Amoda right here in front of me. So, but Amoda, the way I'd like to start is to talk a little bit, if you don't mind, about your journey and how you got to, a little bit about who you are and how you got to where you are today.
Okay. I'll start with kind of my story post-academia. I spent a lot of time in the academic world, and that was a very dark period for me, really cut off from my feelings and quite depressed. There were many depressed periods of depression in my life, and that carried on throughout my young years and my adulthood, but really kind of the real transformation starts after that, when I left behind the world of academia and I started doing a lot of inner work and not only meditation but primal therapy and lots of cathartic techniques. And I spent many years doing that, and that was really my seeking. That was the seeking to discover who I was beneath those very compacted layers of conditioning that had created this wall between me and life that ended up as depression. And there came a point where a certain release and joy and peace came, really after I'd spent quite some time in India. And there was a deep surrender to life as it was, and there was no more depression, and things weren't necessarily perfect on the external level, but internally there was a lot of spaciousness and a lot of peace. But I was surprised that in my moments of solitude, there was a darker void appearing within that had nothing to do with my external circumstances, and that even had nothing to do with my internal state of peace or joy or happiness. And this took me by surprise, because it had the same flavour as some of the points in my life where I'd been taken to the brink of suicide. And whereas previously that had been an attempt perhaps to escape the conditions of my life, this time there weren't any conditions to escape. So it was a whole new inner landscape. And like I said, it took me by surprise. But I had enough awareness, if you like, to not create a story around it, to simply allow it to be that experience. But what was being experienced was an inner barrenness, a real dark landscape where there was no new life in it. It was barren. And two things happened. To me, it was like I experienced it as a dark night of the soul. It was like there was no way through it. There was no way round it. There was no understanding of it, because, like I said, it had no apparent reason. And so I finally surrendered. I finally gave up trying to figure it out, or even trying to find a way through. And I think that was the key point. The key point was the surrender. Two things happened. One was I received, if you like, an understanding of what this dark landscape was, not just as a personal understanding, but a global understanding. It had a collective meaning to it. And the second thing that happened, and I can go more into that if you like, but more importantly than that, the second thing that happened was that as this inner void of darkness got stronger and stronger and became more all-engulfing, I really saw the mechanisms of mind that distract itself from that. And they were very subtle. And I remember a very poignant moment when I was just sitting on my sofa in my living room on my own, and I had this impulse to go and read a spiritual book on my bookshelf. I was sitting on my own and having a cup of tea, and it was, I don't know, probably a wintry day in England, and it was just a nice thing to do, just pick up a book and read something inspirational. But I really saw how that was a distraction from facing something on the inside that was all enveloping and absolutely threatening to the sense of self. So I stopped and I didn't move. And I know it sounds very simple, but it was a very profound moment in that stopping. It felt like I'd stopped the momentum of a lifetime of compulsive movement to just do things that seem normal in life, like read a book or make a cup of tea or have a piece of cake or something. But I just saw how all of those were actual distractions. Not always, of course, we have to interact with the world, but in that moment, and certainly in my particular relationship to life, without, in solitude, I was living on my own, so it was solitary. And so I stopped, and that felt like a huge, not a huge effort, but certainly a turning around of what seemed like a very ancient mechanism. And it felt like a death. It felt like I was totally giving myself to this dark void. And it was totally unknown. I had no concept of what this darkness was, this dark void. And it seemed empty, and it seemed cold, and it seemed all-consuming, and it seemed annihilating. And somehow I surrendered to that. And in that surrender, it was like I merged with it. There was a merging. And in that merging, the I disappeared. And in that disappearance, there was only love. But that love had no content, and that love had no... it wasn't attached to anything. It wasn't conditional on anything. And that was wonderful. But the important thing that I found was that from that point on, and I had no, again, preconceived idea or imagination where this might lead or what might happen. But from that moment on, and it was a fresh discovery in every part of my life, was that there was no more victim left. So all victim consciousness, even being a victim of my own feelings or my own mind, we're victims of our own feelings when we attach to the positive and we only want positive thinking. And then when we have a negative thought or a negative feeling, or we feel bad or whatever, then we tend to beat ourselves up about that, or we believe that we're not enlightened, or we're not spiritual, or we haven't done the right thing, or we're not good enough, or not perfect enough. And then we're back on that seeking mechanism again. Well, all of that stopped. All of that stopped. And it stopped over and over and over again in every interaction I had. So I could really feel as I moved in life, as I took the first breath in the morning, as I got out of bed, as I went about my daily life, as I interacted with people, as I interacted with my work, as every aspect of my life, I could really feel how that old mechanism of being a victim of reality, being a victim of life, completely evaporated. But I could also sense if there was any veering off from that, because there was always a subtle pull. But so I found that I could live in presence as openness from that point on. But it was very fresh. It was very, each moment was new. It was almost like I was discovering that in each moment. I guess that was a profound shift that then allowed that unrestricted awareness, unbounded awareness, to then become embodied, which took a long time. Right. It actually took many years after that to really to seem to go through a purification process.
Well, I wonder if I'm thinking about practice. So I'm wondering a couple of things. I'm wondering, do you think that state can be induced? Is that, how would I, for example, welcome that state? And second, I want to ask about the practice of that after you came out of that. I hear you saying that you saw it as a new opportunity to practice not being the self or practice not being the victim, or just really a noticing of the tendency to want to do that. So I'm just wondering if it took practice after you had that initial experience, or whether it was just, this is how I would have used to have done this.
Yeah, it was effortless after that. It was effortless. There was no practice. It was effortless, but there was a noticing of that effortlessness and that newness. And it was in the noticing of it that I suppose that's a kind of practice. It was a kind of vigilance to that. Perhaps, and it's so hard to remember now because it's become an ordinary state, right. But perhaps at the time and perhaps for a while, and that's what I call the embodiment process, there might have been certain situations or circumstances or interactions which did have an old pull, and then I could notice that. But I wouldn't say it needed a practice. It was more a vigilance, just a noticing, a seeing, and just in seeing it, it seemed to realign itself very, very quickly. Now, we can turn that into a practice. And I often speak about that in my talks and in my teachings. I don't call it a practice because I feel that sets up a kind of mental idea of something that we do, and it divides it from the rest of life. But I do speak about the willingness to turn our full attention to presence and to openness in each moment. In each moment, to notice where there's a move away from presence or there's a closure against openness. And that can be a practice that is consciously applied but requires some effort. The effort gets applied when there's a noticing that we've got caught up in stress or irritability or frustration or anxiety or constriction of some kind. So then it can become a kind of practice, and I would invite people into that. But it does happen effortlessly when that knot of self as a separate entity from life gets dissolved. And that's something that you can't practice, but you can bring your attention to the distractions, the distractive mechanism of the mind, the distractive movement of mind, where when pain or challenge or darkness, inner darkness arise, and how we move away from that.
So if we can't, if you will, cause it to happen, if we can't induce that, is the practice about just making ourselves ready for that moment when grace comes?
Yes, there's a benefit in the preparation, and I guess everything is a preparation up until that moment. The preparation has many different aspects to it. And actually, you mentioned some of my books at the beginning in the introduction, and there was one book which we had spoken about earlier, which we didn't mention, which is the Change Your Life, Change Your World. And that has 10 spiritual lessons for a new way of being and a new way of living. And actually, those 10 lessons are part of this practice or part of this preparation. And they're kind of guidelines that allow the inner jewel of awakeness to be polished. So really the practice is of polishing. And one of them is presence, the other one is openness, and obviously there's more. So yes, there is preparation, and really everything that we do on the spiritual path, whichever path we're on and whichever direction we're coming from, is the preparation. So there's not just one way, there's many ways. What's important in that is the willingness to not turn away from anything that comes up within that, to not make the practice the safety net. And that's why I often don't speak about practice, because it does become a safety net, and that's a big pitfall on the spiritual path. So it's like, yes, do everything that you can, follow every practice that you can, follow what moves you, what speaks to your heart, what inspires you, but at some point even all that has to be surrendered.
Okay. I would ask, and I hear me wanting to grab on to a practice, but what is it that you would bring to us? I know I heard you speak about a vision experience that you had, and that you had some lessons from that. You had a couple of points from that you were teaching. So let me just ask you, what is it that you would have us know as folks who are also on the journey to awakening? And I may be putting words in your mouth, and I don't want to do that. But really, what is it that you would share with us?
I don't come with a pre-planned teaching, if you like.
Fair enough.
There aren't any steps, and there aren't any processes, if you like. And I know that's what the mind wants.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. It wants to know how to get from A to B.
Right.
And what I work with directly is what's happening now.
Right.
What's being experienced now.
Right.
And perhaps more importantly than that, what stands in the way of true freedom now? What stands in the way of relaxing so deeply that the whole search for anything more than this reality as it is strife. All the striving to be a better person, to be a more spiritual person, to be a more awakened person, whilst it is the grit that builds up a momentum which may bring us to the edge of the deepest surrender. At the same time, it can be what stands in the way. So I know that sounds like a paradox, but when I work with people, I listen to them, and I listen to where their ideas and their concepts and their seeking and their ideas of what it is to be spiritual and what it is to be awakened and what it is to be enlightened. I listen to where those concepts, ideas are actually standing in the way of discovering the freedom that's here beneath that and beyond that. Because it's actually we spoke about seeing through the eyes of wholeness.
Right.
Seeing through the eyes of wholeness is an undivided space of awareness. It's not of the divided mind that believes me to be not good enough and therefore I need to do more practice or I need to achieve this state. That's the divided mind. Yeah. Right. So I'm really always guiding people to what obscures that undivided reality here and now, which essentially is a deep relaxation into being. Yeah. And perhaps the most structured teaching that I offer is silence, although silence itself is unstructured. But if we were to, I'm always pointing people to silence, the silence of being. Yeah.
Yeah. Would you say it's more akin to a change in perspective than a practice that I need to master?
Yes, that's a very good way of putting it. A change in perspective. But the change in perspective is not one of the mind. It's not changing from this mind to that mind. Yeah, it's a change in perspective that moves from the horizontality of mind to the verticality of being. And in that, the shift from horizontal to vertical is surrender. There's only one way. It's the surrender of everything. It's the surrender of all clinging to knowing through the mind. Yeah. So that's why whatever practice we're doing, whatever belief system we're in, whatever spiritual path we're on, whatever we're following, wherever we are at in our own personal development, it's always the same pointer. What is being clung to here and created as another part of the self, as another scaffolding that upholds the sense of self as this or that?
Right.
And are you willing to surrender that? Because that's what it takes.
Yeah, right. Okay. Well, and in, let me see if we have any comments here we should look at in terms of any questions. You guys who are listening should remember that we are happy to answer the questions that you post. You are welcome to take the mic. I'm happy to relinquish the mic so you can ask your question that way. I don't really see anything that needs to be answered. Now, I did want to ask you about a couple of things, and I think that I've probably asked you so much about practice that you're going to say, yeah, that's it, when I ask this question. Let me ask you, what is the spiritual shopping basket?
Well, yes, that is the spiritual shopping basket. The spiritual shopping basket is the compulsion, the addiction to add more spiritual knowledge, to add more spiritual practice, to add more spiritual imagination, if you like, an imagination of what awakening will give me. That's a spiritual. That's part of the spiritual shopping basket. It's not necessarily a commodity that we go out and buy, or even a teaching that we follow. It can be that, but there's a more subtle layer to it, and that's the continuing movement of mind that wants to imagine that if only I get to this place, if only I awaken, if only I know myself as not self, if only I discover non-dual awareness, if only this or that, I will something. I will feel bliss, or I will never feel pain again, or I will live a perfect life, or only good things will come to me. And this is where the examination of what stands in the way of true freedom, of true awakening, gets really useful. That's where we can really polish the mirror, is by seeing that. And that's actually quite difficult to admit to ourselves sometimes, or even see, especially for seekers who've been on the path for a long time. And I speak with a lot of long-time seekers, and yet still there is this almost final veil, this subtle agenda for what, or expectation for what awakening might give me. Right, yeah? Right. And it's always about me and my life, and how can I be better, how can I be more complete, how can I be more whole, because it's still coming from the perspective that I am not enough, that there is lack, and that's separation. Yeah? So the spiritual shopping basket includes that part of it, which is the much more subtle inner realm of accumulating ideas and concepts and imaginations and expectations, which, if we examine those, are not living in presence. They're still living in an imaginary future.
Right, right. Yeah, and so if I'm walking along with my spiritual shopping basket, I assume that you would tell me to stop and do what? I know, do. I know. But I assume it's
stop.
Just stop. Yeah.
No do.
Oh.
Just stop.
Just stop. Right.
The invitation is always to just stop. And the mind doesn't like that. The mind wants to stop and do something, or stop and find something, or stop and there's a follow-up. But the stop, when it's complete, brings you to the edge of mind. And then there's a kind of inner scrambling around for something to hold on to. But the stop is the the stop is the stop is the inner teacher. Yeah. The stop is the inner teacher. You, my invitation is for you and each person that I would be speaking to invite that stop in themselves. Not to wait for somebody outside of themselves to invite the stop, but to invite the stop themselves. That was in my description of meeting that inner landscape of darkness without the distractive mechanisms of the mind. In my own experience, that was the stop.
Right.
That was the stop that stopped everything and changed everything. It turned it around. It was a full stop. It can't be just half a stop. It can't be a stop with an expectation that, stop, but I'll get something from this. That's a bartering system. That's not a stop. That's still the shopping basket. You're bartering. You've gone out on a shopping expedition. Yeah. Right. Yeah. It's a full stop. It's a stop that means there's a willingness to be totally obliterated, that you don't exist anymore. It's an existential situation. It's not even a spiritual situation. Let's not even call it that. It's an existential stop. That's what it takes. And in that sense, that's another level or layer of throwing out the spiritual shopping basket. You're not actually throwing just out the contents of the spiritual shopping basket. You're throwing out the basket itself. Yeah? That basket is the whole idea that there is this spiritual and not spiritual. I would call it existential. It's an existential inquiry that's happening if true freedom is to be revealed. And this doesn't, the mind doesn't like that.
It doesn't, because I'm still trying to figure out, okay, so now how do I do this?
Yeah.
And I imagine myself not distracting myself. Not Facebooking or not, whatever it is that I do. So, yeah, the mind doesn't like to hear just stop, because the mind doesn't, my mind doesn't know how to stop. Yeah.
And it's not something we can make happen. Again, there's no recipe for this. There's only that willingness in you, over and over again, in small ways, in big ways, but only if that's what the burning flame of desire is in you is. Right. The question always comes back to, what are you looking for? What do you really want? What are you really asking for here? Because that's a clue as to what stands in the way. And, one person's not more worthy than another just because they've awakened. Right. What are we on the spiritual path for? What is it that we're trying to get? Who do we think we're going to be? These are the kind of questions that I kind of invite you to unravel. That to me is more enlightening than any practice.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds great. I'll run right out and do that. She gave me something to do. No, that's great. I do appreciate that. Let's see. I'm still inviting you guys, and I'm actually checking this. Excuse me for a moment. I'm actually checking the on my little tablet. I'm also signed in, and I don't see any hands, so I'm not sure I would see it on this little tablet. I'm not sure how the hands show up. So If anybody has their hand up, maybe somebody wants to just type the word hand. It would be easier for me to see that, so I could give you the mic. But I am happy to turn the mic over to anybody who wants to ask a question. I'm also happy to ask any questions that you guys type on the board. Okay.
Silence, everybody.
Maybe they're all stopping. They'll join in here in a minute. It's entirely possible that I'm missing them. Let me open this up on my computer for a second, just to make sure that I'm not missing anything, and no hands up. Okay. I did want to ask you about when you face that, you talked about an inner barrenness. You talked about, in my mind, I'm hearing the abyss, that people talk about looking into the abyss. And I wondered why it was different for you after your trip to India than it was prior to that, when it was actually, it was felt more, like you said, edge of suicide type thing.
Yeah. The root of both is the same. I realised that the attempts to suicide, or that feeling which was right at the brink of it, was partly in response to my personal circumstances. Certainly, when I was younger, in my teens and round about that age. But in my later years as an adult, there weren't any immediate circumstances that would have, needed me to vacate the premises. But what I realized afterwards was that it was the same root as the abyss in the spiritual dimension, in that there was a desire, not a conscious desire, and certainly I wasn't on a spiritual path then, but there was something in me that was yearning for self-annihilation, an annihilation of the false self, of the whole sense of identity of me, and somehow it just wanted to be obliterated. So already the search for freedom, the inner search, had already come alive in me.
Wow.
Now, because it wasn't conscious, and because I wasn't on any path of awareness or self-inquiry, and I was very young, and I was very much in the academic world, so I had learned to use my mind without using any other part of myself, so I was pretty cut off. So all of those conditions meant that the only expression of that was the attempt to suicide. Now, of course, there is a personal history in that made that expression possible. There's certain conditions and certain parts of my personal history as a child that would have, that would lend themselves to that kind of outer expression, right, both as long periods of depression and the attempts to suicide. So I did work at some point in my early adulthood with therapists and, different support systems to unravel much of that personal story. Now, as that unraveled, and I did a lot of work around that, a lot of release work and breath work and therapy work and all sorts of crazy things and wonderful things, as that released and those stories no longer, or those memories, those stories, those energies, those emotions no longer had a hold on me, it became more subtle. It was still the same. The self was still there. Me was, the whole self-identity was still here. But so the search became, or that search for that quest, that desire, that inner desire for self-annihilation became more subtle. And perhaps that led me to India, I don't know, but I did end up in India. And what happened there was another layer of letting go of the me that held fear about, really just fear in the face of the world, in the face of life. It allowed me to let go of that because I was, if you like, put in situations that really brought me face to face with that fear. One of them was sitting on a dark beach, isolated beach, with no other people in a very rural part of India, totally on my own, without really any possessions. That really brought up a lot of fear. But the fear wasn't about the external environment. The fear was about the internal relationship to that. Really, it was, again, another abyss. Like, I was totally alone. Or so it seemed. Right. But in that moment, in that experience, and it was an extended experience, I was actually alone. I felt myself to be existentially alone. And that allowed me to face that. And so another layer of fear fell away. And it was after that I was able to come back to my life in the West with a much more flowing, open, surrendered relationship to life with all its ups and downs, and without withholding myself from life. I'd spent a lot of time being alienated from life because I was withholding myself somehow. Somehow I was just in life. I saw myself as inseparable from life. That's why it was surprising when this other layer of the abyss revealed itself. But I think it's because of all that other work that had been done and all that other release and all that other letting go that this more refined, if you like, abyss revealed itself. And this one had nothing to do with anything on the outside whatsoever.
It had no story attached to it.
No, none. Yes.
Do you think that was part of what was going on? The fact that there was no story made you more ready to explore that?
In some ways, yes, because it was much more perplexing. Yeah. It's like, well, what is this? If it has no cause, right. If it has no reason, if it has no meaning, if it has nothing that I can say, it seemed to have no beginning and no ending and no direction. And so I was completely perplexed. Not that I was trying to figure it out with my mind. I'm talking about an energetic relationship to it. It's like that the mind had nowhere to go with it. There wasn't something else to fix about myself. It wasn't to do with my parents. It wasn't to do with my relationship. It wasn't to do with my interactions with the world. It wasn't to do with my spiritual practice. It wasn't to do with anything, it seemed. It was just purely existential. And we just said that it didn't have a story in it, but actually it did have a story in it. That story was one of separation. Not the story of my personal history, but the core wound of humanity, which is one of separation. That we are born into form, and in that birth we are alone, and in our death we are alone, and in every moment of our experience, as the I, we are alone. And that aloneness can become, or does become, a sense of separation. It may have lots of stories attached to it, but in its purest form, right. It's simply the story of separation.
Right.
as consciousness descends into form and is born and incarnated into that. It's a kind of sacrifice that consciousness makes as it condenses into form and is born as an individual entity, or an apparently individual entity. It loses itself in that and creates an identity of separation. Now, that's what came up. That's what came up. And so there was that story in it, and it was experienced as a excruciating abandonment from existence. You could call it God, you could call it spirit, you can call it whatever you like. I think at the time I did experience it as God, even though I wasn't comfortable with using that terminology, but that's what came to me. I am absolutely separate from God. And in that moment, I surrendered to that. And surrendering to that, I realized I was one with God. Again, not an intellectual realization, but an energetic experience. And it's from that point on that when I say there's no victim consciousness, there's no separation. There's no separation. Now, that doesn't mean I walk around in blissful oneness with everything, exuding love, and it's not like that. It's more the shift that happens in the way things are seen. I mean, I still operate in the world, and there's still a three-dimensional reality to maneuver, and there's still, apparently other human beings to interact with, and sometimes that's comfortable, and sometimes that's not comfortable, and so all of that still happens. The human experience still happens, but there's no division in that. In other words, there is not a divided stance internally. It's all included, it's all allowed, it's all open to.
I have been having an experience lately that feels like it's pointed in the right direction. And that is, that's not a bad way of putting it, because it feels less like I'm coming from here and seeing out, and more, it feels more of a broader perspective. And I have a really hard time putting that into language. That's about the best that I can do. But I can tell you that oftentimes, particularly when I'm particularly aware of it, I feel different in my body. I have a different relationship. I don't know if any of that sounds familiar. I guess I want you to pat me on the head and say, good job.
It is difficult to put into words, because what we're speaking of is beyond language, beyond words, beyond the mind that can conceptualize it. And and it is a deep relaxation that brings you into body and brings heals the split between mind and body. Wow. And you start experiencing life from an inner knowingness that is not of the mind. It's an inner intelligence that starts to guide you from within, but it's not an inner intelligence that's affiliated to any spiritual ideas or spiritual beliefs or any of that. Or even what's right and what's wrong. It's just very natural and very organic and really our natural state. It becomes effortless, but it's radically different from operating through the divided or divisive mind that weighs things up, and of course we have to use that tool of the mind in certain situations. So it's not like that just disappears, and but it's like mind gets put into its rightful place
as a servant.
Yes, as a servant.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you know when to pick it up and when to put it down.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, instead of it always being in the driver's seat.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Again, the opportunity is there for you folks to ask questions. I know Amoda Ma would love to hear what questions that you have. I did want to, and I listened to your Bat Gap interview with Rick Archer. But I wanted to ask you about something you said in there, because you talked about the original title of your book, Radical Awakening, was How to Find God in Everything.
That's right.
And I thought what you had to say about that is very important, and I'm sure it's something that our listeners will be interested in hearing. So can you talk about, whether or not you are describing an experience where you find God in everything, or whether you have found God in everything?
Everything that we're speaking of in this conversation, in this dialogue here, is about that. That title for the book was inspired by, as I started writing the book, I came across a book of poetry, and one of the quotes in there was from Tagore, and it simply said, "In order to find God, you must welcome everything." And that really spoke to me, because that had been my experience after that falling into the abyss,
right,
where everything is fully met in unconditional openness and absolute unwavering presence. Everything, every moment of the day, every internal experience, every external interaction, and it's total. And that spoke to me, because when I say find God in everything, that's what that means. It means by being unwaveringly present and unboundedly open, now and now and now, you discover. Even discover is not the right word. It's not about finding anything or discovering anything. It's a revelation that happens in that openness, in that presence, which has no boundary, it has no limit, it has no location. What is revealed is your essential nature, not as a separate self, but as the wholeness that is totally at one with the totality of experience. That's God. So that's really what I meant. And in the book, I speak about how that's experienced in every aspect of life. It's not just in meditation practice. It's not just in the inquiry process. It's in every interaction that we have. Now, again, we're going back to our original dialogue. It's not something you can make happen. It happens naturally once you're fully awakened. On the other hand, it can be pointed to, because in pointing to it, you see what stands in the way of it. And it's the polishing of the mirrors of seeing that start to reveal that. It's the polishing of the mirrors of the divided, the windows of the divided mind, that you are able to be fully present and fully open. Because it's only the divided mind, which means the mind that divides itself from its experience if it doesn't like it, if it's not, if it's painful, if it's challenging, if there's some story in it. It's only the divided mind that that closes, contracts, or turns away from, gets pulled back in fear, or attaches itself to an imagination of a better future. Yeah? So this moment is never experienced in its fullness and openness and presence. But it's only the divided mind that stands in the way of that. If there's no divided mind, presence and openness is the reality. That's all there is. There isn't anything else. Reality, life itself, cannot be closed. It cannot be held back. It cannot live in the future. It cannot live in the past. It's only our divided mind, which is the only avenue of perception that we have, that can make it appear a contracted experience, or a turning away from, or a not being fully present. Yeah, so there can be pointers to what stands in the way, and that starts to clear the way.
Right, and it sounds to me like we often talk about a process of purification, and it sounds to me that that's when you talk about polishing the windows of the divided mind, you're talking about a purification process, perhaps through self-inquiry. And I did hear you speak some about self-inquiry. Am I right about that? Is that what you're telling us, that we need to? It sounded like it a while ago when you were saying, question, who do you think you'll be when you get to the end of this path, and that sort of thing.
Yes, that is the inquiry. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So it would be questions like, why don't I just want to sit with this emotion? Why do I want to go talk on the phone to my friends, or go Facebook? Or can you guide us a little bit more in that self-inquiry process?
It's going to be different for each person.
Right.
It's not the who am I question, although that might be part of it. It's different for each person. And but there's a rather than asking why am I doing this or that, or
right,
ask, am I willing to stop?
Wow. I'm writing that down.
It's the seeing of the addictive mechanism of ego that's always running away or towards something,
right,
running away from or towards something. It's that horizontality of the egoic mind, the separate self,
right,
the divided mind. Yeah, we're calling it different things.
Right.
They're all the same thing we're pointing to. It's that horizontality when it's seen, and when it's seen to create suffering, which is what it does, because it's setting up a craving or an aversion and moving towards something or running away from something. That's suffering. When that's fully seen as suffering, then the question is, am I willing to stop?
Mm.
And am I willing to stop means really being in the unknown.
Mm.
Just allowing. It's like when we see that horizontality of the egoic mind, we can see how our attention is given to it. So the question is, can I allow my attention to just rest in awareness itself? That's the stop.
But you're not advocating sitting on the couch all day either.
No. This is an internal movement. I'm not talking about your body and what it does. I'm not talking about your external. Yeah, that may need to happen sometimes, but that's not what it's about. It's in this moment. In this moment, the mind is moving. Whichever moment what you're examining. It's the stop happens here, and here, and here, and here. You can be moving around. You can be incredibly busy. You can be doing things, but still there can be a full stop. That's called living from silence. Living from silence, as silence. And then that silence includes everything. It includes the movement. It includes the busyness. It includes the doingness. It's not about stopping anything. Sometimes that our external stop needs to happen as well in order to experience the internal stop, in order to experience or fall into the silence, in order to fall into the abyss. That's the support that can happen through meditative practices. That's the support that can happen through sitting in silence. Yeah. It points you in that direction so that you can feel it and experience it. And once tasted, it's like a pool that is so inviting. So even if you dip your toe in it, the soul or the being, the inner being wants to immerse itself totally in that. So once it's been tasted, once the toe has been dipped into that pool of silence, then you will notice where that silence isn't being lived from. And you'll want to return to that. So then that's a deeper inquiry.
What the deeper inquiry being, what's keeping me from going there right now, from being there right now?
Yeah. What stands in the way of this? Because this silence is always here. Whether we're speaking or not speaking, whether I'm doing or not doing. But first of all, you have to have immersed yourself in that silence totally. You have to know yourself as silence and be that silence and then move from that silence.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. That really touched me. Thank you. Okay. I'm not seeing any questions on the board. So let me move on. Let me ask you about one of the things that I heard you talk about. By the way, did it get dark there where you are? Because the lighting seemed to change in your room. It's probably fine. I thought maybe the sun went down.
It got darker outside, yes. I've noticed, but it probably has.
So yeah, things got a little bit darker. I'm sure it's fine.
Do you want me to put the light
on? If you'd like to, let's try that.
Stand up.
Okay.
Hold on, let me try.
All right.
How's that?
Oh, yes, much better.
Yes, I hadn't even thought of it.
Okay, great, thank you. I wanted to ask you about the need for a teacher. I was actually very surprised when I heard that you emphasized that before. So I think some of us feel that we have teachers, physical teachers that we can lean on, we can look to, we can listen to. Some of us only have that in the form of the internet. I don't know if you still believe it's very important to have that teacher, and whether or not you believe that it's important to have that kind of one-on-one rather than just watching videos on the internet. So if you'd speak to that for me.
Again, I think it's very different for each person.
Right.
I don't think there's a formula. My primary teacher was not in his body. To me, that was seemingly a blessing, because I in some ways found it easier to surrender to the formless rather than to the form. But that's just me.
Right.
It'd be different for somebody else. There are, if you like, pros and cons to each side of the argument.
Right.
Not that it's an argument, but each side of the perspective. There's a danger in spiritual shopping,
right,
to jump from one teacher to another, especially with the internet, especially with the availability of all the videos and recordings. And then people get it. What I see is a lot of people getting it because they've heard it, and somehow there's an understanding of it, but it hasn't been embodied.
Right.
And some of the more subtle veils that continue the divided mind are still in place. So that's when a real live teacher can be a great support in that. And I think that's in some ways irreplaceable.
They can kind of
irreplaceable. I don't think that, just watching videos or reading is
right.
going to replace that.
Right.
Having said that, that's not always the case. It's not a guarantee that if you're with a teacher that you're going to wake up. It's not a guarantee, some people wake up without any teacher. Some people wake up just through their life circumstances. So there really is no right or wrong way.
Yeah, I keep asking for a formula. I know. I apologize. Yeah. Let me ask you then.
I just say this, Jacqueline.
Yes, please.
So I'm seeing a pattern here in that I don't have a formula.
Right.
And every question that you ask me doesn't have a real answer.
Okay.
And unsatisfying as that is to the mind, and I'm only saying this now because actually it's a pointer to what I'm pointing to, is not that we end up being wishy-washy and vague, far from it, but as soon as the mind takes a stance. So I could take a stance by saying, yes, you must have a spiritual teacher, because there's a truth in that. There is something that happens in that intimate relationship that cannot happen otherwise. There's a trust, and there's a intimacy, and there's a seeing that happens in that relationship that can only happen in a relationship. Right. And that's what it is with a student and a teacher. It's a relationship. Right. So there is a truth in that. And then I could throw that totally out and say, awakening or freedom has nothing to do with the teacher. And sometimes having a teacher is an impediment, because then we get attached to the teacher or the teaching, or we give our authority over.
Right.
And for me, I went the other way. Although I had various teachers at certain points, most of the time I found that I wanted to break free of that, because I had a tendency, or I could see the tendency, to start to incorporate the teaching as part of my awakening.
Right.
And actually, I needed to discover for myself I needed to discover for myself what is true in myself, for myself. Not because of some spiritual teaching, not because of what I'd heard, not because I've been guided in a particular way. And that's not to say that I had a lot of support along the way, but at some point I had to throw it all out and say, find out what yourself, for yourself, what is real here, what is true here. Yeah. So it's different for each person depending on where they're at. And then I've worked with a lot of people that I know could do with a teacher.
Right.
Yeah, because there's an avoidance going on that isn't being faced in that very intimate way. So, yeah.
Yeah, no. Just like you just did with me. That's great. Let's see. I'm trying to see if there is a question on the board. I don't really think that that's an actual question. I did have sorry, I got myself distracted with what was being said on the board. You do talk about experiencing a deep surrender to life. I assume that this is what you've been pointing us to all evening.
Yeah, surrender is the key. Surrender is the key to meeting reality as it is. The deepest acceptance of our experience. And in that deepest acceptance, there can't be anything but openness and presence. There's no avoidance in that. There's no recreating ourselves in that. Yeah? It's free of self. Presence and openness, when it's complete, when it's total, has no self in it.
Yeah, and I recall actually from the earlier talk that we spoke about, seeing through the eyes of wholeness, you talked about not self-referencing.
Yes,
yeah.
That's it.
And so self-referencing would be where I see things from the perspective of an individual self.
Yeah, or the self-referencing is the me that wants to get something out of this, wants it to be better, or wants it to be different, or wants to change it, or fix it, or wants to elevate self, or feels a victim of it. There's a constant self-referencing, and once again, that's the horizontal movement of the egoic mind. Yeah. In full presence and full openness, which is the deepest acceptance, the deepest surrender into this moment as it is. There's no object and there's no subject. There's no me having the experience. There's no me trying to get something from the experience, or to change it, or to manipulate it, or to run away from it. There's the subject and the perceiver and that which is being perceived merge into each other. They merge into each other, so there's nothing but this, and this is both empty and full. This is both the emptiness of awareness, unconditioned awareness, and full of the content of that awareness, or what appears in that awareness. But it's not lost in that content. The me is not lost in the content. The me gets lost in the content when it self-references. When there's an attempt to get something from that content, define itself by that content.
Right.
Yeah. So you define yourself by that content. If you have a good feeling, you're feeling happy. Right. I'm happy. Now, I'm happy means I'm elevated, I'm good, I'm enough, I'm this, I'm that. And so it goes on. You get a cascade of self-definitions. Yeah? Or you have a bad feeling, you're feeling sad, or you're feeling irritated, or frustrated, or scared. And then there's you get lost in that, and the self-referencing is I'm bad, or I'm not good enough, or I'm not spiritual enough, I need to work harder, I need to do more meditation practice, what's wrong, and so on and so on. And these are subtle cascades, ripples that happen. You're lost in the content of awareness. Yeah?
Right, yes.
And so that's not presence, and that's not openness, that's not the deepest acceptance, that's not surrender. So we can use all these words, and I float around, as you can see, between words, because different people will hear that differently. To some people, surrender is totally unimaginable. It means something particular to them that is out of reach. So that may not be a useful term to use. And for other people it is. And so on and so forth. Yeah.
A while ago you said, you talked about, I think what you said was talking about consciousness making you called it a sacrifice, I believe, the sacrifice of coming through the seemingly separate individual.
Yeah.
I'm curious as to why in the world consciousness would do such a thing.
Yes. Because it delights in the return to itself, either at death of that form,
wow,
or in the death of ego, the annihilation of self.
So it's kind of like a game of hide and seek, huh?
Yeah. It wakes up to itself.
Wow.
It discovers itself. It becomes conscious of itself. And that's existence. That's the whole play of existence. Without this play of formlessness, consciousness, incarnating as form and then returning to itself, either through waking up or through the portal of death, there's no existence. This is the play of existence. There'd be nothing, and nothing is unimaginable to us because,
because it is, right? Right, yeah. Right.
We only know existence because we exist. This, to not exist, for the whole of existence, to not exist is unimaginable.
Right.
But this play of, if you like, birth and death, light and dark, awake and asleep, is the fabric, the very fabric of existence, of us being able to experience ourselves as existing and to see the world as existing and so on and so forth.
So it's a vehicle for experience.
Yes, experience. And for consciousness to experience itself.
Right.
It experiences itself through our experience. Now, why? You could ask why. Well, why? And we could go back and back into, why, where, and how did this all begin? It's a question without an answer.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's lots of theories, spiritual and scientific even, but that's not the point. Even if we land on something that makes sense to us or has meaning to us, the question itself is irrelevant.
Right.
Because the question itself, or the answer, the seeming answer to that, is only a satisfaction for the self that wants to find meaning in this existence.
Yeah, right. It's funny. I just read a comment that said nothing is unimaginable to us, which is what you and I were just saying. I just read it differently. I thought they were disagreeing, but no, they're saying exactly what we just said. Yeah, it's beyond the thinking mind's ability to comprehend. We're about out of time, and I have not had any questions on the board. They've been strangely quiet this evening. They're all stopping, like we said. But I want to ask you, number one, can you tell us your website address, sure, so I can share it with them?
Yes, my website is www.amodama.com. So that's my name, Amoda, A-M-O-D-A, Ma, M-A-A.com.
And do you do like one-on-one sessions, or what will we find when we go to your website?
Well, there's a few changes coming to the website, so that will be upgraded and refined over the next couple of months. But essentially, what's on there is much the basic structure. There's a lot of videos there. All my talks and are recorded, so there's lots of videos for people to immerse themselves in. There's bits of writing and obviously my calendar page. So I'm in the Bay Area, and I teach here, and there's various gatherings happening and talks and conferences, and I also teach in Washington and Seattle. I don't really do one-to-one sessions. So I think the website does actually say that I do, but that's coming off.
I was going to call you in about an hour, so no, that's easy.
It's the groups and retreats, and
right.
One thing that's going to be offered more and more is the silent retreats.
Mm. Yeah, and I guess that's where you would have silence, like during the day, and then come together and discuss that.
The whole
thing.
Retreat is silent, other than the inquiry. Yeah. So there's periods through the day that are short dialogues, talks, and then followed by inquiry. But the rest of the retreat is totally in silence. So no note-taking, no journaling, no music, no reading, no interacting with each other, no phoning your husband or your wife or your this or your that. It's totally silent, so that you come face to face with that which stands in the way of silence. And then the questions or the inquiry that may come in the actual sessions that we have throughout the day will have a different quality.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've seen that, I'm sure.
And it's amazing how scary that silence is, initially anyway. How it's amazing where it takes us, and the deep transformation that can happen in that. Deep transformation, because it's like we're faced with ourselves. It's like the whole perception has to turn into this.
Right. I have some folks saying thank you, gratitude for speaking. I do have a question, so let me read this to you. I don't know if you're familiar with the Course in Miracles, but this sounds like it may be based in that. It says, consciousness was the first split after the seeming separation. How would you answer the question that you may not even be consciousness? It may take more context. Lioness, I'm sorry, I don't know who Lioness is. Do you want to take the mic and ask that? Okay, I can't see hands, so if you want to take the mic, just please tell me. We've got just a couple minutes left, but we certainly it certainly would be nice to have a question from the audience, from our other listeners who are gathered here with us. So, Ken, does anybody have their hand up? I'm asking my administrator now, my sanctuary director. Oh, Maureen. Okay, Maureen. It says she can't take the mic.
Was she asking the question?
Maureen was the one asking the question. How would you answer the question that you may not even be consciousness? She states first, consciousness was the first split after the seeming separation, which again comes, I think, from the Course in Miracles. She said, how would you answer the question that you may not even be consciousness? Yeah.
I would ask back, what is your experience? What is your experience? Who are you? What are you? What is your discovery of what is truly here as you? Not as you, as the separate me, but as the essential nature of the one that's asking the question. Because this isn't theoretical. It doesn't come from a book or a teaching. It has to be discovered in yourself. So that would be an ongoing dialogue that we could have. That it's like, who is asking the question, and what is it seeking in that question? And is that an obscuring of the reality of your true nature, or is it a revelation of the reality of your true nature?
Yeah, and Maureen's written here, she says, all heart, maybe all love. All heart. Love doesn't explain itself ever. Yeah. Okay. We are just, it simply is, she says, yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
Okay. Okay, you got 2 minutes. Do you want to say anything other than goodbye?
Well, I just want to thank you. Thank you for this opportunity and this dialogue, and thank you for inviting me. I've enjoyed the conversation.
Oh, thank you so much. I have as well. I have. And I'm going to say namaste.
Namaste.